from the amazing Mark Titchner, who I know, most of you are very familiar with his work. He's one of the more high-profile artists in London. I think most of you have seen his recent show at Bilston Grove. And weirdly enough, although probably many of you are very familiar with Mark from exhibitions such as the Turner Prize, one thing that you might not actually know about him is that, Mark, you're actually in the top 5 most popular essay topics of all time here at Camberwell.
I didn't know that.
You're up there with John Cage, Basquiat, and Anna Mendieta.
I have no idea about that.
Yeah. So if anybody's considering a dissertation on Mark Titchner this year, this is your lucky day. So without further ado, I'm just going to let Mark do his thing. Do you want to take questions as you go along afterwards, or what works best for you?
Either. I mean, it's quite good actually if you have questions as we're going along, because I'm more likely to remember what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I was going to show, did you mention that recent show like at Bilston Grove? Did you all see that? Like, because I was going to show that video, and if you've all seen it, like, there's no point.
It's totally worth seeing again, because I think the installation is quite overwhelming, and actually to see it on one screen I think is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, okay, cool.
Oh, super. Okay, so without further ado, Mark.
Yeah, so I mean, I was going to talk about that show which actually came down kind of on Sunday, because I haven't really done any sort of, like, even whilst that show was on, I haven't really talked about why I did it or what it was. So it kind of gives me a bit of an opportunity to talk about it and have a think about it. I mean, the show, Bilston Grove is a very sort of particular space, so it's a kind of like deconsecrated, brutalist sort of church. It's like the earliest poured cast concrete structure in the UK, and I was commissioned to make a work for it for the gallery in the park and Bilston Grove are having a kind of anniversary. I live quite nearby as well, so there's that kind of connection, and I guess I had this idea almost straight away of like wanting to knock the space out, so kind of making it very dark. And I suppose the other thing that I wanted to do was to think about that idea of what it meant to be in a kind of space that was once sort of consecrated, so the kind of a kind of ex-religious space. So I suppose there's an aspect of the work which was to do with sort of revelation or the point of receiving some sort of external message. So I guess what I'll probably do then is I'll just show you the work. I'm going to show you the piece in a slightly different form. For those of you who didn't see it, it was basically 2 kind of large screens on top of each other, but at either end of the room. So it's actually kind of impossible to see it in one go. And the reason for that was wanted to have this idea of like almost having like eyes in the back of your head. So you kind of, there's information kind of going which you can't kind of take all in one point of view. So the idea of being sort of made to feel slightly uncomfortable within the space. The texts kind of read in 4 directions, so they kind of read like on each individual screen, and then, like, for instance, as you can see, they would read downwards like this, and then they would read across. So you kind of had this like 4 possible screens which all kind of complete each other. So there's a sort of number of permutations. And the sound for the piece, I guess, is quite important, because we used a like 7.1 surround sound system, so it actually kind of moved around the space, and as you move around the space, the sound changed. So today, I'm just going to show you like 2 screens of it, and the sound will just be sort of standard stereo. So it'll be slightly, it's different, but you should get an idea of what the thing kind of actually is and was and how it worked. And then I think if you're happy to watch that, I'll kind of explain a bit more about that, and maybe if you've got some questions at that point. So I'm going to flip over to that now, and it's about so say it's about sort of 17 minutes. It's fairly fast moving in terms of imagery. There's not actually any strobing, but if anyone is kind of sensitive to flickering images, just bear that in mind. happening now is that 7.1 is trying to go into the speakers that aren't here. I better stop that, otherwise it'll go around again, and then we'll be stuck. So, is anyone still awake? And I guess one thing, so that's the piece, or at least the sort of version of that piece, Rose. I guess one thing that's quite important about that thing is like where it leaves you at the end, like the difference in state that you're in from the beginning to the end. And the reason, it starts off with this kind of like red dot, which is a kind of motif that runs all the way through it. And the idea was almost immediately just to set a kind of pace. And the red dot is basically supposed to be the blood flow behind your eye. So there's kind of this idea of being inside it and looking out, but like I say, that rhythm kind of runs the whole way through, and the idea is to kind of put the viewer in a kind of certain state. So I guess there's a very present feeling of being manipulated whilst you're watching it. Before I sort of talk about it, what it is a bit more, one important component of it is the sound, this is a performance, a very dark performance, but the sound was done by two musicians called Alexander Tucker and Daniel O'Sullivan, and I've collaborated with them quite a lot over the last few years, but I guess the sort of brief in terms of working on it was to create this kind of spatial kind of sonic environment, and especially using this sort of 7.1 system where it kind of moves around the room. And I guess there's a fairly obvious kind of choral aspect of it which relates to the kind of the church and the experience, historical experience of going into a kind of religious site. But I mean, they worked a lot using kind of dictaphone recordings, like looped up, of the words in the text. So there's a kind of layering up of the language in the same way that it's kind of layered up in the visual kind of side of it. So I'm going to talk a bit about what it actually is. I guess the sort of germ of the work came from, I was reading Lawrence Wright's book called Going Clear, which was a kind of history of Scientology. It came out last year, and he very briefly mentions this kind of self-hypnosis routine that L. Ron Hubbard used to do before he went to bed, and it included things like him sort of saying, "You have a beautiful singing voice, you're a great writer," you know. And I guess I have a long-standing kind of interest in the relationship between, I guess, received images of the self, and I'm talking about things like media and advertising, and the relationship between things like self-improvement and brainwashing and the individual and the state. And around, I'm going to show you basically some of the documents that I was kind of interested in when I was working on the piece. One of the things I looked at was this thing called QBARC, which is a declassified CIA interrogation manual. And I guess it's basically, it's kind of interesting because it's got within it things like, you know, do not do this in the field, like written in, when it was declassified, basically they had to go through it, and all the bits which we now, like, i.e. it's all right to torture people, someone went through and put do not use torture, you know, and that was kind of a backward justification of it. But what I was interested in particular was these sort of 3 stages of interrogation. And I think that's what I tried to do in the film, was it's in these 3 sections, and there's a kind of very gradual movement in the language. It starts, the first section basically uses this kind of like you know, you love, that's the sort of structure of it. The second section introduces this kind of second word, which is you are. So there's an idea of a kind of another level of abstraction, and the third level uses this you are not unloved, or it uses a double negative. So there's this kind of like very slight manipulation of language. I'll go into the reason for that a little later, but the idea is to kind of create this sort of quite simple kind of this interpolation, basically, so that the movement from this is a term that Althusser uses when talking about the relationship between the state and the individual, but the movement from a kind of subject to an object. So the idea of kind of being made into something abstract, a kind of fact, rather than something complex and without edges, like a person. what I tried, so basically in this system of interrogation, you would have 3 kind of procedures that you would go through, which basically are like, kind of like make friends, kind of find out, what they know, and then try and break them. And then the 4th bit is actually kind of getting information. Now, what I tried to do in the film is take you to that point where you would give up the information and then kind of stop. So there's this kind of like point where it's like, I'm not really asking. It's slightly like all the language or the words in the film are ones that I took from like kind of self-help kind of self-improvement videos. So I tried to use kind of like terms which seemed positive all the way through, but like to actually think about, well, actually what does it mean to kind of be adored, or what does it mean to be not unloved? This is Alfred Korzybski, who was a great photo. He was a scientist and philosopher, but he wrote something called the theory of general semantics, and basically set out this idea of how the way that we experience the world is through 2 sets of filters. One is like the physical experience of perception of the world, which is very peculiar for and different for everyone, and the other one is through language. And he basically showed how there were distortions and kind of levels of abstraction in language which were kind of so large that we can't actually have a real language prefigures everything. And one of the big parts of a quite complicated theory was the problem of the verb to be, and how a sentence like a really simple sentence like the sky is blue, he would say that there were different levels of abstraction within that sentence, and actually a better way to look at that sentence would be to say the sky appears blue, like that every objective experience isn't kind of real. Subjective experience is like everything should be taken with doubt, and fact should be seen as being sort of something which is easily manipulated. And this system got further after his death. 15 years after his death, a guy called Dr. David Borland kind of formalised this system as something called E prime, which is like a language that doesn't use the verb to be. And again, just looking at how it's quite, if you actually try and spend a few hours not using any conjugation of to be, no is, no are, no am, all of those things, how much we say is like kind of anchored in this kind of identification and certainty. So I guess that was a kind of so I heavily use that kind of like, in the first section it's like, if you say you love, like there's not, and then you introduce in the second section you are loved. Like there's a kind of subtle motion between those things, like the are turns it in, rather than you actually being something, it turns it into kind of something which is kind of has to be externally received and qualified. And that's basically what happens through it. Like the passage of the work is that it becomes more and more about some movement from the individual to the idea of being a kind of unit within a larger kind of social structure. So the work's called Rose, which was for probably should jump for. So this is the Rosicrucian cross, and I guess there's a lot in the work which is to do with hidden knowledge, I suppose, abstraction and sort of the esoteric, and the Rosicrucian order is a kind of like occult kind of organisation that dealt with the idea of illumination. So this is you see these letters I-N-R-I, and we commonly find this in like kind of religious artwork. In the Middle Ages, I-N-R-I which is actually a kind of Latin term, was introduced into kind of religious paintings to basically show, and it stands for in Latin, Jesus, King of the Jews. But in the Rosicrucian cross, and which is kind of weird because it's like the idea of making a realistic painting of the crucifixion and having this language in it which didn't exist at the time. So that's. But in the Rosicrucian cross, it represents something else. It represents the Hebrew 4 elements. So I am for water, now for fire, ruach for air, and then I can't pronounce that very well. I Besha for Earth, and the work, the 4 screens, I don't know if you could tell, were kind of composed of the 4 elements. So that the top one there being air, the bottom one water, and then on the alternate 2 screens you had like fire and earth. And then in the second section they all get cut up. And the reason for that, again, I suppose, was this idea of a kind of like holistic kind of whole kind of entity. So I guess, yeah, that's probably all I'm going to say about that, unless you have any questions, and I might talk about some other work. Let's move swiftly on then.
I've got one question. Might be a bit of a simple question. I know Jermaine goes a lot further than this, but just out of curiosity, who are you addressing? Is it you? Is it a viewer or some higher power, or anything in particular?
I mean, that's a good point, really. I mean, I think the point is that I'm quite interested in trying to create a direct experience for the viewer, like one which you then kind of abstract afterwards. So it seems quite like the you is definitely the viewer, like in this work, whoever that viewer may be. But I think the other side of that is to think about the voice, who's talking. I was doing a talk in China a couple of years ago, and someone said, like, why do you always use capital letters in your work? Why do you always have to shout? And I was like, well, actually, that's really true, because that's the point. The voice in the work is always shouting, and it's always supposed to be this kind of like disembodied patriarchal figure of authority. You don't know where it comes from, you know, you don't know what it is, but it's the thing in your mind which is kind of making you what you are rather than what you're not. So I guess I try and, like, it certainly isn't me. Like, I don't know, I'm not really interested in shouting at anyone, but I do, like, what I'm trying to do is illustrate or communicate that sense of being the subject, of kind of having this voice. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just how I feel, you know, as a kind of individual in the world, but there was an interesting point, actually. The day after the show, there was a German curator, a friend of mine, who saw it, and he said, don't get me wrong, it's not like I didn't like that work, but I just have a bit of an issue with it, because he said that I grew up like being, you know, slightly older than me, but, you know, like with a really formal conceptual and kind of art history upbringing, and he was like, I was always told it was morally wrong to try and emotionally affect the viewer. I think that is quite an interesting point, because I suppose what we were talking about then was like, that's what cinema does, or that's what TV does. You know, any sort of TV show, you have this like obligatory kind of, you know, soundtrack of like emotional keys that kind of go off at, you know, I don't know, whatever it is, MasterChef, or, you know, anything reality TV, it has this certain kind of like, you know, I don't know what you know, Mogwai or something will come on at a certain point always, you know, as this kind of like figure of kind of epic, and then they'll have like some power ballad. And I suppose what I was interested in was like actually tapping into that and using it. So it's almost like trying to expose the things that we're kind of already slightly addicted to. But yeah, in terms of, I guess there's a slight desperation that I feel that I don't think. I think that art kind of should exist in a way where it doesn't have to necessarily be only understandable if you have a kind of like you know, the right framework. So it should, you know, I try and like with my texts and stuff, I always try and use language that anyone can understand. You know, like a child could kind of read the words. It's not about trying to take complicated and complicated ideas, and also ideas that are outside of, you know, any work which has to do with language also has to do with the limits of language and things that language isn't very good at talking about, like it, you know, the sort of highly sort of abstract nature of some of it. So I don't know. I have to think on about that moral aspect of it.
I've got a question. It's because on this, a lot what you're talking about is about language and, you know, I guess about your perception and quite conceptual things. But I think one of the most important things, especially with the installation at Dalston Grove, but also I think with even just the scale and the materials using around your works, is that, you know, that is primarily for me, and is always experienced as a physical. When you go into the installation and you've got the 4 screens and it's a 72 channel surround sound, and it's a mental experience, but you physically feel it, like it's almost like a tangible knowledge or something.
Well, it is to do with feeling small, I think. And I sort of, when I was a kid, my granddad was actually a vicar, and I used to sort of spend a lot of time like following him around sort of during the summer holidays, and just being left alone in those sort of big sort of churches, and like looking at the windows and feeling small in that kind of space. I think the other thing, I was talking to Mustafa Halusi about this, and he was saying that the thing about our sort of generation of artists is we kind of grew up looking at sort of Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger, and that was like the kind of and it was the kind of time of billboards, and that kind of stuff doesn't really exist. That kind of advertising is fading now. It's kind of turning into something else. So I think the sort of scale of looking up at a billboard or something, something like that, the idea of the monumental seemed really kind of important to us. But I think it's definitely to do with, feeling like in a world, and it's like you can't see the edges of it. That's kind of the ultimate aim, but not in a kind of, I guess it would be easier to achieve in a sort of virtual realm, but I don't know if that's kind of quite what I'm interested in. So this was, I'm going to just, this is the actual show. So when I first left art school, I didn't really have the studio space, and I guess this is relevant to what Patty was saying. I had this idea that I wanted to make quite large scale work, so I pretty much straight away got into doing wall drawings, and this later kind of turned into working a lot with like large scale digital print. But when the South London Gallery reopened, they asked me if I would do a wall drawing for this wall drawing show, and I hadn't really done one for years, but it had been long enough for me to forget the reasons why I stopped. So I was like, oh, okay, fine. And I did it, and I kind of really enjoyed it. And I guess that was part of it. It was like, okay, it's all right to do things you enjoy again. So the show, kind of the idea of the show at the CGP space down the road was to kind of do a show mainly of wall drawings. So this is a work, this is based on a kind of ongoing piece where I've been working with, I guess what you would call civic mottos. We all live in these places where our towns or cities or boroughs have these kind of mottos, and we have no idea. They're a kind of flag over our heads, and we don't know what they are generally. So this is the one for Southwark, which is United to Serve, which kind of seemed fairly kind of dark to me. This is a kind of slightly earlier one. This is one I made when I was doing a residency in Toronto a couple of years ago, and their motto is like diversity, our strength. And I used this kind of RGB colour scheme as a kind of, in this first work, as a kind of tribute to General Idea, who are a kind of Canadian art collective who famously made this AIDS wallpaper word virus piece, which was shown at the same museum. And I kind of did a installation based on this kind of slogan, working with like local youth group to do the pieces. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. This is one of the other works in the show, and again this is a kind of ongoing piece. I've made, I don't know how many versions of this now, probably a dozen, which have varied in scale to kind of these large scale billboard works to like a sewn kind of patch version of it. And it was based on Saatchi and Saatchi's 1979 advert for the Tory party, which said the Labour isn't working. And it's kind of like commonly sort of known as one of the most effective kind of and popular adverts of the 20th century, and kind of what people go as far as to say that it was kind of the difference between kind of Margaret Thatcher's election and Knox. It was so kind of powerful. And I had a show in Berlin in 2008, and literally like about 3 days before the show opened, which I've been working on for I don't know, best part of a year, the kind of world kind of collapsed on itself as the banks kind of went down, and I kind of made this piece right at the last minute as a billboard in Berlin, and I suppose it's quite straightforward in a way. I mean, I guess it was, again, trying to sort of reduce everything down to a very kind of, the idea of the world as a concept, as a pre-existent kind of concept. And I guess the thing with these ongoing works is it's like every time they change, where, you know, I think I did a version of this in Iceland last year, in Icelandic, which obviously had a kind of different connotation because the banking crash kind of started there. So this is the other wall drawing in the show, very kind of difficult to kind of photograph really. This was a piece called Hand Must, Mind Must Work, which used this typeface called Rose. So it's a kind of link to the other kind of venue in the show. So this was a kind of, it's like a kind of faux medieval typeface. And basically what it did was like paint it and then kind of like attack it with a belt sander. So it was kind of like partially erased. So kind of disappeared into the wall. I had this like school group come round and they were like, you did that with sponges, didn't you? And it did kind of have that kind of vibe of slightly kind of crafty. But you can see how those kind of works related to each other. I've been working a bit with these kind of ideas of these kind of like word loops. This isn't just, which yeah. So there's these kind of the other works in the show. These I've been large kind of wood carvings, and these. This is a better shot of those. But yeah, these were kind of based on these word loops as well. For instance, I started working with these carvings like years ago because I was just spending so much time on the computer. I needed some kind of like physical kind of activity to do, and they're basically like carved out of wood and then burnt to make them black, because I couldn't come to a satisfactory kind of like state with like what to do with them, like how, and also I wanted to make them look kind of old, and so I started burning them. And then these ones were gilded with aluminium because, again, I suppose I didn't really want to kind of use paint. I wanted actually to apply a material to it, and they become kind of like quite sort of like mirror-like as well. That's not very interesting. I was going to show you this film as well, but I think we've seen enough telly. So yeah, this is a film called Be Not Content. I mean, it's I guess it's a similar kind of vibe to the Rose work in that it's relates to kind of the language of kind of self-help and hypnosis. And I guess the kind of what I was looking for in this work was, you know, if you look at like a banknote or a passport, you have this kind of like watermark, like to stop it being forged. I basically wanted to create like a moving kind of watermark. So it's almost like a fog where kind of bits of imagery and stuff kind of pop out. So like the dots on that would be like ticker tape stuff from the stock market, and yeah, there's various kind of bits of like coins spinning around, but it's all heavily kind of abstracted. And I guess one thing that I've been kind of doing a lot of over the years is kind of working on these kind of trying, as well as doing work in kind of gallery spaces, I've been kind of really interested in how art can kind of fit into the outside world, the everyday world. And when I sort of started off doing that, it was very much a case of like, you know, it started off with fly postering and posters, and it gradually moved into sort of light boxes and billboards. And basically what used to happen when I was doing the fly posting stuff, you would put stuff up and like literally go back, get the camera to photograph it, and someone kind of pulled it down, and there was this real frustration that you realise that the only people who actually see it are the ones who are destroying it. So I kind of gradually over the years worked towards trying to make these kind of more kind of permanent works. So this is something I'm just finishing at the moment, which is basically a big stained glass window, which will look actually like that in opposite St Martin's. So it's like a 2-story high corner piece. And I guess what I've been, it's a way of kind of like trying to move the work slightly towards a more kind of stable presence in the kind of. So this is a proposal for Scow Gardens, which is behind the South London Gallery. So it's wrapping their tenants' hall. I don't know whether it's actually going to happen or not. And I've been, also working, I suppose, like a lot of people, these works don't kind of end up in galleries necessarily, so they don't normally necessarily get seen by people, so I thought I'd put a few of these in. This is something working on in Manchester at the moment. And there's some, basically, I've been starting to like take those digital images and like turn them into some sort of sculptural kind of material form using kind of metals and woods and stuff. So in a way, they're much more kind of like craft-like, even though they're kind of using kind of fairly modern production techniques. This is the World Isn't Working piece in Iceland. I mean, I guess most of what I do deals with language in sort of some form or another. Sometimes, like this, it's very kind of obvious, very clearly kind of words, and this is one of these reliefs. Sometimes, I guess what I'm going to show you now is a little passage of abstraction. This is one of these wall reliefs. And this is a piece which is installed actually at part of the Maudsley Hospital. It's a piece called Our Knot, which is a kind of metal relief. And these kind of knots are something I've been working on for a while. So basically taking words and spinning them over themselves. So this is based on the word our, O-U-R, and the kind of three letters are kind of spun over themselves to form this kind of complicated kind of visual knot, which, so the language is there, but it's in a form where it kind of requires you to sort of decipher it. And I suppose the idea of the knot comes from the graphic form, which is like you find particularly in Celtic art called the love knot, where you basically, in order to sort of show a kind of relationship between two objects, you would kind of interweave them. So it's the idea to do that with language as a close-up. So it's like stainless steel and acrylic and then sort of back sprayed, so it kind of forms this, it gives it this artificial kind of blue light, even though there's no lighting in it. And it's one of those sort of works as well where it's all mirrored, so you can't sort of help but see yourself when you're looking at it. This comes out of some earlier sort of experiments with language. Like I say, sometimes the words are very clear and sometimes they're not. This is a piece I made for British Art Show 6 in many years ago, 2006, where I did a series of these kind of abstract kind of sigil, I'll explain what that means, kind of artworks around Gateshead. Sigils are kind of, this is it's a kind of like esoteric or occult magical kind of form of taking words and giving them a kind of graphic form for a will or desire, particularly based on an artist, South London artist called Austin Osman Spare. So you can see one of his kind of sigils up there. So what you would do is you would take something like I don't know, I wish that I was ... and you would overlay all those letters together, eliminate the duplicates, and you would come up with a kind of condensed kind of form of it. And what I did with this piece in Newcastle was I took the local authorities redevelopment plan, which was called the Newcastle Plan, and there was basically the room for improvement kind of section of it, which include things like we want to have more ethnic minorities represented in our governance, these kind of things, and use that as the kind of will or desire that I then turned into these billboards. So there was this kind of idea of having these like spells or something like placed around the city on one level, and then on a really simple level, the idea of just using advertising as space for something where you didn't know what the hell it was. This is a kind of weird piece that I made in Bristol last year called a Naiad, which is a kind of, I used to make these kind of weird pseudo-scientific machines, and for some reason I decided that would be a good idea to do that again. And it uses, I got this piece of kind of decommissioned Victorian machinery and attached various bits. It's a bit difficult to explain what it is, but it uses kind of tidal information to kind of pass sound through this like speaker cone, which basically causes this marble dust to move around, and also the arms and stuff to move up and down on this thing. So it kind of uses, it's the idea of, I suppose, turning information from kind of one form into another kind of abstract kind of form. But it's a weird work, actually. And of course, I hid all the text in this bit without sort of telling them what it was. I was talking a little bit about these kind of advertising kind of spaces, and I guess, like I say, I started off very much kind of thinking about billboards and posters and stuff, and it seems like, you know, this technology is moving more towards the kind of, you know, this is what we're finding, these kind of video screens. So I've done a few projects where I've kind of inserted these kind of works onto public video screens. This one's in Bristol. The guy who did the photos of these did a really good job. So there's like Hendu with this one, and then these two kind of, I don't know, set in front of this one. And there's that original world isn't working piece. This is, how are we doing for time, by the way, Pat? I've no idea. Okay, good. Ages.
No, you don't have to use it.
No, I've got, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, so it's just whether. So this is kind of the beginning. This is the first one of the kind of digital text things that I ever made. So this was in 2001. And I never actually used a computer. I was rather shocked when I was showing some kids around the show, and one of them was looking at the video, like these animation pieces on the video. She said, "Did you do animation like in design technology?" And I was like, "No." She's like, "Well, how did you make this?" And I was like, "Yeah, but you have to understand, when I went to school, we didn't actually have computers. So I'm not, you know, it took till 2001 before I started using a computer to make work. And I studied painting, and I think part of the reason that I stopped painting was because of I couldn't work fast enough. And when I started, even in my very sort of rudimentary kind of way, playing with Photoshop, not knowing what I was doing, I felt incredibly, you know, strongly, this is how I should have been making images all along. You know, the idea of, like, I'd always worked with layering and collage, and like intuitively it just felt right. And I'd also done this other really dumb thing, which was like, I think pretty much all my life, like reading and sort of writing and keeping notebooks of text had been really important to me. And that kind of ranged from, you know, what I'd hear on the radio or what I'd see around me. And I'd never ever sort of thought about the possibility of using it in my work. And I had this I'd been making quite big abstract wall paintings, and they had kind of been quite successful, but I think because they were quite good for, if you were a curator and you wanted your show to look a bit kind of like groovy, have like a big kind of abstract wall painting, and I was actually making paintings of my parents' psychedelic wallpaper from the house. So it's like, and then people started hanging stuff on top of it, and I was like, this is becoming wallpaper. And I was trying to think of ways around that, and I just had this like moment of like, oh, if I write a word on the wall, then you read it, you know, this really simple thing. It's like, and what happens when you read it? You internalize it, and for a second you kind of turn your brain off, you just let it in, and then there's this processing that happens. And I guess as soon as I had that realization, I suddenly realized I had all this material that I'd collected over the years which I could actually use, and that it took me like 10 years after art school to actually realize that.
I'm kind of curious, because I think there's always that hesitancy for artists to use text in the work, and there's something about text, I think, because it's so final somehow, it's so concrete, it has like, you know, an actual, you know, pinpointable meaning. And, you know, also because the kind of things that you're interested in, you know, is power, new age, you know, emotive experience. It's you know, at what point, you know, like when you have slogans like, you know, why is there something instead of nothing? I mean, how do you decide on the text? Is there ever a cringe factor? I mean, the slogan's using a well map, and what's the bit that transforms it from being something that's, you overly earnest?
Well, I think the problem as well is also, and I don't know if I'll get through this, but I have messed this up a few times. Like, when you get involved in something you kind of actually are politically connected with, it's like when it becomes propaganda, that's kind of problematic. No, I kind of like, my attitude towards that was kind of like the more cringeworthy the better, like in a way. You just kind of want to, I mean, especially these early ones, it's like, you know, my real aesthetic kind of key to this was like psychedelic art, kind of weird religious Baroque art, and also really heavily, you know, I mean, I lived in South London, you know, actually just across the road in Havel Street at the time, and this was, you know, London, South London was quite sort of different then, and then, you know, like my studio on Rye Lane, there was like all kinds of churches in the building, and like this constantly be given these crazy kind of like religious pamphlets with like these graphics which were somehow trying to depict a spiritual, you know, like awakening, but with loads of lens flare. So that was really what I was thinking of, was that same sort of slightly kind of naff, how do you, what aesthetic do you attach to something which is beyond aesthetics? How do you describe rapture using colour and words? I mean, this text, kind of, my idea at the beginning was, it changed. I mean, I think I was interested in the lack of meaning of things. So this was around the time, you know, heading in towards the sort of second Gulf War, and like mass protests and like nothing changing. And there's just this sense of like, there's no politics will change, everything's gone, everything's dead, nothing means anything. So I just was really interested in how none of the text that I was using at the time was supposed to be like so blank. They were about kind of like nothing. They were kind of like trying to sort of say that nothing matters. You can have this, or you can have this, or you can have this, and it's all equivalent. None of it, if you don't attach meaning to it, it doesn't mean anything. And then on the other hand, I mean, this line, this was the first text I used, was from like a country and western song. But I kind of liked the fact, you know, and I liked the fact that it seemed to be about, well, it's the fundamental question of all philosophy, isn't it? It's like, and then someone was, yeah, but then someone, well, yeah, I think there it is in Spanish on a billboard with a cat. But someone was asking me about that text, and they said like, oh, do you know that's like the first line of Heidegger's last lecture? You know, I'm like, yeah, of course, yeah, definitely. But actually, no, I don't. And the point was that I was really looking at like how who says something matters. And when I started making these works, no one knew what I was doing, so they didn't know it was me. So I kind of liked them being voiceless. So, you know, if I use like a Britney Spears line or something, and then using, you know, a line from Nietzsche on the next thing, and they kind of seem the same, but you don't know who's talking. So there was that kind of like interest already, I suppose, in authorship and kind of the kind of machinery of power. You know, who do you listen to? And I guess that just got pared down a bit. I mean, when I started off, I was just fairly quickly, I started realising that I was going to have a problem with typography, and that I didn't want it to be like, oh, if I do this in a Gothic font, it looks like this. So I drew up this font, which I used for years, which was basically just the simplest font I could come up with in a grid. And it was also, I'd started doing these wood carvings, and I wasn't very good at it, so I couldn't carve any curves. So I had to like have this font which only had straight lines, and I used that for years until I guess it got to the point where it was like people knew it was mine, and then it was a bit like, need to let it go now, it needs to not look like mine.
What's your feeling or opinion on your work there being placed amongst such other, because I've not seen, you've not shown at least today any other examples of your work being started?
Well, prepare to... No, I mean, it's really, important for me that the works do kind of exist in this kind of space where it's like part of the sort of noise of the city. And also, one of the projects I'll show you in a minute was like, as soon as I realised that a lot of the work was kind of a lot of my thinking was relative to advertising, that then it became more and more important. So I guess what I'm saying is, when I started off, the reason that I did this piece was because my friend basically broke into the Lightbox, and which he still has, and said, do you want to do a poster? And I was like, yeah, fine. And it's like, I've no idea how to do that, but we'll just do it. And that just started me off. So this is, I mean, basically, this project's quite an interesting one in that and in fact you asked earlier about who is it that you're addressing. So I did this piece I've worked quite a lot with Transport for London because I've been quite interested in, that as a fundamental part of the experience of living in a city, being in this confined sort of space, and how, where you go, what your brain's doing, kind of idling away in this kind of space. So we did this project where we gave away, it's like 20,000 of these posters at the 5 busiest stations in rush hour on a Monday morning, and then I didn't really think anything of it, and then they got in contact with me and said, oh, we've got these empty poster sites, and would it be all right if we put these posters up? And I said, yeah, sure. And again, didn't really think about it. And then one morning I got to London Bridge on my sort of daily commute, and they were all the way up the escalators. I'm just like, shit. And like every day I was just confronted by this thing, and it was like the first time that I sort of felt like becoming the subject of the work. I was like feeling like directly hassled by my own kind of work, and like which was quite interesting. And the other thing about this project was that it's the one that I've had the most feedback on. Like, first of all, TfL received complaints and stuff about it. So one of the first complaints about this was that someone said you're telling teenagers to kill themselves. I don't know where that came from, but I have had like maybe a dozen or so people get in contact saying, can I have a copy of this poster? And it's weird because like quite a lot of the people seem to be like, I hated my job, or I've left my wife, and this just kind of stuff where I see it as kind of it was good, it was like a positive. And for me it was like, I just saw it as being like this really oppressive kind of work. And I think that's a weird thing, is how, and going back to Rose, like using this kind of language in self-improvement, I see it much more as being like a trap or something very constrictive or oppressive, rather than being something affirmative. And like quite often the response to the work is, oh yeah, that's a really good message, kids, that you can make, but to me it's, well, what does that actually mean? Who's telling you if you don't like your life? What is your life?
I mean, I'm really curious about the aesthetics of it, because it's going back to the Spanish one where it's in situ with the other billboards and advertising. Because I always find like the aesthetics are so aggressive and so oppressive, and actually they're like an assault basically, and they're actually quite nasty. But when you actually pair them up with other advertising, it seamlessly fits in, if that makes sense. And I'm kind of wondering with these ones, because when I saw these on the tubes, it is like a double messaging. You've got this really positive message, but then the aesthetics are completely Orwellian. And
well, you've got all this stuff as well, like, which is like the necessity of kind of.
Do you think like our visual literacy is just becoming eroded, or?
I mean, my idea with the imagery, I mean, the work's kind of changed quite a lot. I think, the aesthetic now is, for me, is a lot kind of flatter in a way. Like, I've tried to kind of get away, just because I got bored with it, from this sort of heavy sort of psych. I mean, my idea with these images was always to take the background to the point where it basically breaks down. Like, so it's kind of like, if you go any further, it was always a balance point between the text and the image, and it was like to do with us. It was nothing more than a certain kind of feeling about it, which was like just being on the edge of it being really gross or like just horrible, like aesthetically. And I would just pick and choose. I mean, I would take lots of found imagery and kind of layer it up. And I guess the aesthetic I was really aiming for was this kind of like almost like rubbing your eyes really hard and just having lots of blurred kind of images coming out. I mean, this is a project I did, which kind of all fucked up actually. But this was this is the first one of the Cultural Olympiad sort of projects in London. So I did this piece called 31 Day Programme on, I can't remember how, it was like 5 or 6 of these bus stops around bus stop roofs. So you kind of viewed it from the roof of the, from the bus, and they were like, they changed every day, and it was like, it would say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it would give you like this, and then the date, and it would give you like a really short message about, you know, some kind of advice for the day. And yeah, it was, again, quite interesting because like the complaints about this were bizarre. Like there was one which was to do with questioning authority, and it was like there was a complaint made about it being like, you know, pro-terrorist or something. So it's really weird because like obviously so much of the public realm is just completely covered in adverts and kind of, you know, stuff where it just slips through the net. You don't even look at it, but as soon as, you know, introducing these kind of works into with a little bit of dissonance, and I think that's kind of the point, is to do stuff which kind of acts a bit like advertising but kind of does something slightly different. I mean, this was an important work for me. So this was one of the first sort of projects with that Platform for Art did, which is Art on the Underground now, at Gloucester Road. God, a long time ago, 2005 or 2004 or something. And that space again was one of these moments where I really, something kind of clicked in my brain. So basically at Gloucester Road you have these sort of 10 archways, and directly opposite that are another 10 archways, and on one side was this space to make artwork, on the other side was advertising. So I was literally put in a situation where like, we were having like a face-off. And I started off obviously with the 10, you know, I did my very literal thing. I was like 10 commandments, and I kind of came across the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, and they did this really amazing thing where they kind of took the thou shalt of the 10 commandments and inverted it to kind of we want. I mean, it just seems such an incredibly sort of powerful and simple kind of use of language. It really stuck with me. And then I was thinking about what is it that advertising actually does? And, you know, basically it says you want or you need. So it was so I had this sort of you want, you need, and then a mirror of it, which was like we want. And I made these kind of 10 works, actually about this size, using this phrase at the beginning, we want. It was quite interesting when I was talking about the work, I was not allowed to mention the Black Panthers at all. That was kind of like totally verboten, which of course I messed up and did in the first kind of interview about it. But,
is that from London Underground?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's a terrorist organisation. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely with all these projects, there's always a slight element of trying to sneak stuff in under the radar. And I think the more you work in sort of public realm stuff, the more you kind of learn to kind of not say certain things or not to sort of flag up certain things. So the idea of this piece was to make these kind of almost like trade union banners, but kind of for a world where instead of like say a regular trade union kind of banner, which is a kind of lost kind of art form in a way, would depict this kind of like idea of a sort of socialist kind of workers' utopia. And I guess I wanted to kind of depict this kind of utopia, but for one where the most important thing was to be a consumer rather than a producer. And I looked at something called the Global Brand Scoreboard, and which is published every year, and looked basically at the top 10 companies. So at the time it was people like Microsoft, Coca-Cola. I mean, bizarrely, given the state of things, Nokia were one of the biggest companies in the world at that time. And I started looking through their kind of corporate manifestos and stuff, and I was really fascinated by the fact they obviously were all using this kind of like really utopian kind of like new speak, you know, which, you know, what the hell does that mean? We want to shape the world's future. So I started lifting this kind of text because it had this aesthetic of kind of being very much to do with like, you know, the idea of making better futures for everyone, but was really the fundamental part of it was like, we need to sell more Coca-Cola, we need to sell more kind of, you know, and you'd end up, so this was Disney, and then this one was Microsoft, and I can't remember who this one was, unfortunately. I think it might have been Toyota. And again, I had people sort of saying to me, oh, I like this one more than that one. This is a nice phrase, this is a nice thought. And I guess, yeah, it's like using some of those kind of tools of advertising to kind of get into people's heads a bit. I made a version of it for a show I had at Arnold Feeney the following year, and I kind of looked again at the world sort of brand scoreboard and saw that some companies had gone up and down, some had kind of changed their statement. Some had seemed to sort of switch text with other companies. And I kind of had this idea very simply of just adding this "and" word and making it almost like a kind of like a shopping list, or like, you know, for a sort of greedy consumer. I guess the thing about this, which is important in terms of the sort of weirdness of this language, so the very bottom, and I quite often forget who said what at the top, you know, in what order, but the very bottom one, we want to be open and transparent, I got from the corporate mission statement for Philip Morris cigarettes. And that seemed, you know, at the time I was like, well, that tells you something. That tells you something about all these companies. You know, no, of course they don't want to be that. They want to be something else. They want to be successful. But this is what the world tells them they need to do, or appear to do. So this is a.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm quite really interested because the aesthetics, we said, is the aggressive and pushy and oppressive and all that stuff, and it's shouting language. But through seeing the work in the history you speak, there's a real timidity there as well.
In me?
Well, not necessarily you personally, but in the work, I'm getting a real sense of an idea, a lost ideal, which I'm finding quite interesting. And to me, I'm feeling like there's a real lost kind of wishful thinking, and it's never going to happen along with the passion and the shouting.
Yeah, it's true. Well, you know, I mentioned this guy, German curator Felix Enslin, had saying about that manipulating the emotions of viewers being morally wrong. The end of our conversation was something like, well, you were always romantic. You know, like, and I guess I do have this idea of, I don't know what, well, I do know why actually. It's to do with kind of the time I was sort of brought up and how I was sort of brought up. But there's definitely, you know, I can't help but have some kind of, I wouldn't say it's nostalgia, but belief that things don't necessarily have to be as they are. And that has to be tempered by like daily seeing, you know, all of us seeing exactly how things are. And it's a tenuous, fragile thing. I don't know. I think I'm interested in nostalgia in that I'm interested in how that can be manipulated and how, you know, every generation tends to be nostalgic about the generation before. So I was born in the sort of early 70s. So I kind of, I guess, without realising, inherited this idea about how the 60s must have been brilliant. Based on, like, I don't know, watching American TV shows set in California, which had very, very little to do with like the experience of, you know, growing up in that sort of Cold War period of like, you know, actually seriously thinking we were all going to die at any given moment, and like every, you know, child of that generation generally having this idea in their head of what you would do when the 3-minute warning went. Like a bizarre thing, you know, like 10 years old thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? You know, am I going to run home? Am I going to do, you know, just crazy. But that was a real thing. I don't know. I'd hope that it's not simply just a case of being romantic about kind of a kind of. Because I don't believe in a utopia. I don't believe in kind of any of those kind of, you know, I know that's crap. So I'm kind of, I guess what I'm trying to do is just reflect upon kind of the state of affairs as they are at a time, and suggest that perhaps we don't always see how things are when we're in it. This is a piece I did in Breda, which is, I got basically a whole series of these kind of advertising borders which were owned by the local kind of municipal council, and I kind of put these posters in there which I guess relate back to this idea of interpolation, of becoming made a kind of a subject, or becoming an object, so there's I guess this related particularly there to kind of particular like kind of policing strategies towards immigrant workers. So this is basically a set of questions which are used in stop and searches. So the idea is that you just like, if you answer all these incorrectly, you basically, it's facts about you, but it changes you into something. This is one of these works where I was talking about, getting dangerously close to being in the kind of propaganda kind of market, which brings me seamlessly onto this piece. So this is a work called Voices You Cannot Hear Tell You What to Do, and I was lucky enough in 2006 to be able to show this on a video screen in Times Square as part of Creative Times' 59th Minute programme, where they basically managed to get Panasonic to give them the last minute of every hour to show a kind of artwork. So I wanted to make a piece at the time which was to do with the idea of the subliminal advertising, but to make it kind of legible. So it kind of like moves fast, but like fast enough that you can read it, and like true subliminal stuff you wouldn't even be able to see. And also there's no real evidence that subliminal advertising kind of actually works. So it was kind of like a false kind of subliminal. And I got this, so basically the main kind of text of it, which kind of flashes up, is this thing which just says, just tell me what you want me to do. And someone sent me these great shots. There's underneath the screen is a recruitment centre for the US Army. So this is from a anti-liberal, a protest against anti-liberal protesters outside the. So this is people saying basically, "Go home, you lefties." Underneath, just. Oh, I lost do. Damn it. This works quite.
Can I just sorry?
Sure.
How do you garner kind of responses? How do you find out what people think? Or does that not matter?
It's very difficult to gauge. Like, I think some projects it's built into it where you do get a response directly, i.e. those ones where it's normally in the form of like complaints.
Yeah,
or
the TFL one, I suppose you can.
Yeah. I mean, I've made works where I'll kind of directly try and involve the viewer in it, but I think that, and ask for kind of opinions. I'll just skip through to that piece. Oh look, there's do. I just want to skip through quite a long way into the future. So this piece here was a kind of remake of an earlier work called Be Angry But Don't Stop Breathing, but it was basically this bit on the right here is a kind of PA system. It's attached to this big sort of carved block. But the idea with that is that the viewer actually is able to basically use the public address system in the gallery to tell you what they think. So I've kind of, and got used for all kinds of things. I've got some great video of people doing like call to prayer and beatboxing and all, and fart noises were very popular. But I think the trouble with these kind of projects is in a way they end up being a bit kind of heavy-handed in a way, and like I kind of on a smaller kind of level, it's not really about there being a definitive kind of response, or they're more to do with kind of creating a space where, like I mentioned it before, this idea of dissonance, the idea of fitting something in. The public realm doesn't exist. The public realm is like, anything which is outside has gone through all kinds of processes of applications, planning permission. The more visible a site is, the more valuable it is, with obviously like television being at the top. And this sort of public realm space is like so kind of sewn up with kind of vested interests. The point really is just to get stuff into that space. Excuse me. It's going to sound great when you listen back to it. Does that answer what you mean?
Yeah, I wanted to say how much you need or want to. I mean, partly because of the nature of the work, it's speaking. It's sort of trying to kind of practice a response.
I mean, sometimes the projects come out of these kind of larger things where I kind of work with sort of discrete groups, so I kind of, I suppose, have a better idea when I'm going into them. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a 2-month residency at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, produced a bunch of works while I was out there. This was one of the banners that I worked on. So this is an area in Toronto called Yorkville, which is basically was a kind of real hippie kind of hangout area in the 60s, and is now kind of like one of the most valuable bits of real estate, being very, very quickly kind of changed and gentrified. And and this was the final work, which was a big banner on the side of the building. But the project itself came out of, I worked for 3 weeks with this group called the Oasis Skateboard Factory, which is basically kind of vulnerable young people failing high school. And they do this kind of course where they are able to get their kind of credits by setting up a company producing skateboards and like skate stuff. And we did a project basically about urban change and gentrification, looking at kind of the historical themes. So in a way, it was like a kind of module for them on social studies and geography, but kind of filtered through this idea of producing an artwork at the end of it. So we based the text "Tomorrow Should Be Ours" kind of came out of like condensing these kind of ideas into something which was like a work at the end of it. So we were kind of like looking at they did basically a lot of photography and looking at zoning in the city, looking at how you have this movement of different types of housing, different communities within where they live. And obviously as young people, they felt that kind of very strongly kind of threatened, because they tend to hang out in these areas which are kind of like getting gentrified, so sort of pushed away from places they feel possession of. So we did a whole bunch of sort of stuff on that, and yeah, I kind of the actual work was based on graphics that they kind of generated and the text that came from them. And then we also kind of made up these individual posters which we went out kind of fly posting around the city as well. But I suppose, yeah, the point being that I could actually have, like it was very much a sort of direct conversation with them. I mean, in a much more expanded way. So this is, I guess, taking something like Rose and like trying to effectively turn it into an experience for the individuals involved. So I was invited by Wysing Arts Centre in 2012 to kind of like come up with they have a residency programme there. So I was invited to kind of stage this residency programme where 10 artists, writers, curators were invited to come and take part in this project for a week. And the project was based kind of on the idea of the self. And I programmed a sort of series of events and workshops. So the idea basically was it would be a social experiment for a week. So it was like heavily, so it was pretty heavy actually. So we'd have like 2 lectures a day and then 2 sets of workshops, and then two practical workshops. Then we'd have like a film screening and then a discussion. And like the structure of it was based on the fact that you'd get these really heavy kind of like people, so we would have someone come from the Bethlehem Hospital to give a presentation about multiple personality disorders, and then we'd have like a flower arranging workshop after that. So this was like from the workshop which was to do with making self-portraits in flowers. And then we would have someone like Simon O'Sullivan from Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths came and gave a lecture about Bergson. And then we'd kind of have, this is a group ceramics workshop. And the idea was that everything happened that so fast you couldn't process it. So you just like put it into this kind of slightly insane kind of state of learning too much. And we had like Reiki sessions, we had like a guy coming to do a presentation on Gergiev and meditation sessions. It was really crazy, and I definitely felt like at the end of it that we would, if it had gone on another week, it would have got to the point where we'd have like sort of power dynamics starting to happen. You know, people would start sleeping with each other, or like, you know, someone would decide that they were the boss, or, you know, it would all. It was, and then we kind of met up again, and we'd had this idea of. What seems quite clear is that it had been a very creative and productive kind of week, and that we would meet up again and discuss the possibilities of how this could work as a kind of alternative learning model. So for people who've been through our, you know, education already, but kind of at the point when they like wanted to learn more about, you know, in a sort of non-formalised way. And of course it was a complete disaster. And we realised it was, the whole thing had been to do with like productivity and kind of the experience of doing it. So the sort of final part of the kind of actual project, and I think this is quite a good ending for it, was like digging this open grave for the big ceramics thing that we did, and then setting fire to it in the rain. And like basically it got so hot that it actually pretty much fired this thing, and it's just exploded everywhere. And we got these like, you know, the kind of residue of the project is like these really fucked up bits of clay, which is quite cool. I don't know if is that a good place to kind of, I mean, I keep going, but I don't know whether that's
Yeah, that's great.
a good place to stop banging on.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you very much. Any questions?
With the one in Dunstan Road and how there's text and sound, how much direction do you have over the music? How involved are you with that?
With that piece, the way that worked was like, I mean, I've worked with Alex and Daniel before, and like actually the first piece that I did with Alex, I actually played on it as well. It was actually at one of the Wysing sort of music festivals, and I kind of didn't really enjoy that. Like I just found, like a really, really uncomfortable experience, to the point where I kind of like completely freaked out sort of halfway through and like just turned everything up. But I think, so with this one I was like, right, okay, I'm going to give you the video, I'm going to tell you what I think in terms of the kind of atmosphere, and I'm going to let you kind of give me it. And I was really slightly worried because I didn't know what they were going to give me back. And actually, I think it was the fact that we'd sort of talked, you know, we'd all spent a lot of time in the space, I know them very well, and they kind of, you know, I hoped that they kind of got where I was coming from. But that, yeah, when the sort of first edit came back, I was a bit like, oh God, if this is terrible, like I'm screwed, because I'd booked like a 7.1 studio for them to mix it in the next week. But it was, I think they got it really well, and they just, like I normally do the sound on my video myself, and it's normally more kind of abstract than what, you know, I don't try and make music, and it felt like with that piece it was more appropriate for it actually to be like almost like symphonic, or for it to be, you know, to push those kind of emotional buttons. So
I just wondered how much of a link there was between the text and the music, which had come first.
the text, I mean, basically what I did with them is I gave them the video, the pretty much finished video, and I gave them the text. And I said, like, you know, this is the material. The video was done. Like, I basically, yeah, it was, I suppose, a reactive. But we had been talking about that piece for nearly a year. So there was definitely a sense of they kind of knew the reference material and where it was coming from and what I kind of wanted to achieve. But I felt that in order for me to feel confident in the work, I needed to get it right from my point of view in terms of the visual side of things first. Hi.
A lot of your work seems to have like religious and political element to it. And then I was curious about how you choose the background image and the colours you perform.
Well, I was saying earlier about these. I mean, I think I'm very much influenced by the kind of art that I saw when I was kind of growing up. So this kind of like, I think these probably are the biggest kind of single influences on the aesthetics that I have. So this is kind of basically kind of hardcore, grindcore so it's like quite. I'm really dumb, right? Because like basically, I didn't realise first art I saw was comics, and like didn't think of it at all as being art. Next art I saw was album covers, and you're like, okay, well, what's going on here? Image and text over the top of each other, and that's basically like still what I do. And I think a lot of the sort of dynamism and stuff, appreciation that I have or don't have the composition comes from looking at these kind of things. So I liked, and also sort of the sort of psychedelic sort of poster art. I really liked the way there was just like this freedom to just bend the text to the point where it's illegible. It becomes, which is kind of what happens in terms of sound with grindcore when you have like some like basically completely indecipherable kind of language, but like still an expressive language. And I mentioned also these kind of religious kind of pamphlets. So I think the aesthetic is kind of a mixture of all of these things. I don't really, yeah, it's also a weird thing. I don't know, when you kind of, maybe it's not like a conscious thing anymore. I just have a kind of idea of the kind of image that I want, and then you just aim for it rather than sort of, yeah. I think it would be very difficult to sort of like suddenly start making something that looked completely different. And it's something to do with taste as well, like them kind of being kind of pretty like slightly nasty or something. I think that's sort of fairly key.
I've got a question because it's a really practical studenty question, because the last few slides you've shown us are almost an exemplary development file, hint.
What does that mean?
They have to, at the end of the year, especially, they have to show their research and the kind of things they've been looking at in relation to their work. And so in these last few slides, like where the work is honestly coming from, the stuff that you're actually into, right? And you can start to visually, it makes complete sense how you kind of got to where you're at.
Well, this is kind of what these slides are. I mean, I grew up in town, like in Bedfordshire, which is like, this was like a pub, like, which I was like, how the hell did this happen? But it's like obviously with some sort of vision of the future. It actually burnt down a bit later. But like also, when I was growing up there, everything was knackered. Like it was all kind of falling down. So this is like the local sort of civic centre. And it had this like amazing mural on the side of it, which kind of looked like, you know, it looks like kind of ARP or like BRAC or something, but it's like actually a map of the town with like that dome at the top there is like the building itself, but it's all fiberglass and kind of like falling off. So I guess that idea of a sort of degraded utopia that never happened is very sort of telling. And I was talking about these wallpaper paintings. So this is that's my sister dressed as a cat for some reason, but this was like the wallpaper of my parents' house. So this is like obviously like the first experience I had of op art, you know, or the idea of visual overload. And you can see, like looking at where the aesthetic from the posters comes from, that it's, you know, try imagining this with like an orange carpet and like 3 purple walls. And yeah, that was kind of, but that, you know, it was standard, do you know what I mean? This is the only photo I have of that wallpaper as well. And then I was really into, see, where I grew up was there wasn't really anything there to suggest any kind of like, it was very industrial, and then when I was a kid everyone got made redundant. It was pretty sort of grim, and then I think I got quite interested in visionary artists like Stanley Spencer and William Blake, and the idea of like seeing the sacred in the sort of profane kind of world. So this is like the Resurrection Cookham, where he basically sees the kind of, you know, the resurrection hope happening in the local graveyard. And I think in terms of like, to me that seemed quite important, like actually realising that it doesn't matter where you live, like it doesn't, none of that, you kind of, if you want to see angels in the trees in Peckham Rye, you can do that if you live in Luton or like in, you know, Cookham or wherever, it doesn't matter. And then
so it seems, you know, when you go to school and you have to kind of intellectualise these things, and I'm wondering, like, how do you get from, you know, William Blake and comics and local community murals and metal album covers to is there, I guess, sort of a more academic discussion or more intellectual discussion? Are you at all bothered by that? Because I said you were the most popular essay topic, and it's usually followed by the Read Zizek.
I'd have no idea what they actually. I'd be interested to see. I don't know what people would write about. I mean, I guess the thing is what I do is, in a way, it's quite it's quite obvious in a way that you can kind of. I try and make a way into it. I don't. And it has I don't know. I can't explain why that is. I mean, I don't. My education is not. I kind of definitely did not come from a sort of background where art has had any kind of real importance, and I kind of, ridiculous. I did my sort of degree at St Martin's, and I pretty much hated it, so I never went back to college. So I think what's always been important to me has been that idea of sort of doing like stuff yourself or doing stuff with other people who are kind of around at the same time. And I guess that is a practical kind of ideology rather than a kind of like one based on abstraction or one based on kind of sitting around talking.
Because I feel like a lot of elements, it's quite intellectual, for lack of a better way of putting it. Because you're dealing with like really big concepts like ideology and power, control, subjectivity. All of these things.
It's true, but then I think at the end of the day, it's also about the end product and filtering it into something that people can immediately. Like I guess that was the thing with Rose. Like I sort of so many things, and especially with a lot of like post-internet stuff, which is to do with like heavy levels of abstraction and aesthetics. Like I find I get pissed off because it's like how it's about aesthetics, or it's about the look of stuff. It's not about aesthetics. But I don't understand how you can make stuff about the look of stuff and then it not be about how those things are made. Did you see what I mean? It's like there's a whole economy behind the way those things look, and I guess and a lot of that is to do with like this sort of heavy abstraction. I guess the thing with like with that Rose piece is that just that weird thing of like actually trying to kind of circumvent that, like the first experience of it to be like just sort of aesthetic, and then sort of like think about it. So it's like actually trying to sort of have a kind of response to something which doesn't have to be prefigured by a kind of intellectual response to it. It's backwards.
I have one last question. This is sort of because you post-internet, I think that's something that's really key to maybe how your work is understood, in that has the internet changed how we perceive these kind of languages, these kind of aesthetics? Like, so you talked a lot about television and advertising. These are analog media and not digital, even in terms of scale. We experience internet media like on a laptop screen. Has that changed the way that we understand?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think it's still forming as well. I mean, I find it difficult to kind of. I think there's like the kind of stakes in terms of what advertising are on the internet. They still seem very, very kind of unclear. Or you look at kind of so much of what's going on and just think like, how does that economically sustain itself? But it must do. Someone's obviously spending money somehow to make this happen. And I think the other side of it is to do with the understanding of how that economy works. So, for instance, if the fact that we're all used to sort of free information, free data, free TV, whatever it is, but actually, there's servers burning 24 hours a day, which are actually kind of, and using metals and using rare earth elements, and every one of those little bits of information has an energetic cost. And all that stuff is not kind of a fully, it will be the next, I don't know how, I'm quite interested in trying to sort of think about how the work can go into the internet as a form of kind of the public realm. But the trouble is, at the moment, it's like, okay, well, but putting a video on Vimeo or on YouTube isn't kind of the same thing. And I was kind of involved with like Sedition, which is a kind of like online kind of art gallery stroke, digital editioning kind of thing. But again, it's not quite right. So I don't know. It's one of those things. It's got a kind of, and because I think about the internet is like that lack of a shared experience. Like it's quite difficult to kind of, I don't know, to kind of make any assumptions really about the way people view things. Maybe it's just one of those things. I'm just kind of not that generation. I can't really have to let someone else deal with that.
Okay. Well, that's it. And thank you very